Topic here is Black Codes, Land and Labor to Jim Crow. At the end of this assignment, you want to be familiar with these terms. You'll need to complete the sources worksheet. And as you see this green box, you want to respond to those series of prompts and or tasks. The prompt task sheet looks like this, where you will have to respond to a series of tasks when you see the green box appear. So on this slide, we see one of the required images right here, and the required image is of children who are convicts at work in the field from the year 1903. And what's important about this image is that the children were taken by the state and forced to serve unpaid apprenticeship without parents' consent. So this is, if you're wondering, potentially a loophole, maybe around that 13th Amendment. Question here is, if you're not getting paid, does that make you a slave? If you're receiving some sort of apprenticeship, I guess that's going to depend on the person that you ask. But we are talking about loopholes and these black codes, which are a series of laws, local and state, that eventually erode the status of the freed slave. Here we see a zoomed in portion of the image. As we continue with some of the issues from the last couple of classes, we know that the Civil War comes to an end, that the South is placed into those military districts, and they're trying to make sure that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment is being followed. Well, at least the federal government is. Down here you see a couple of new terms: sharecropping, crop liens, and convict leasing. And what you're going to find is these may or may not be some attempts to try to reinstate the former way of life prior to the ending of slavery. A couple classes ago, we also addressed what to do with the slaves when you're going to let 4 million people free without education, without resources. How are those individuals going to be able to provide for their needs? And here we see a solution from William Sherman issuing Field Order number 15, which is a required source that you're going to have to analyze. Pretty much what he's asking for is the redistribution of land, because then that land could be given to the freedman, and then that individual would be able to work and provide for his needs and wants. If this does not happen, the freedman might be subjected to some of these indirect methods of forced servitude. Question you want to think about: how could these practices result in continued indirect slavery? This is just a recap from a couple of classes ago where we looked at this particular chart. I'm not asking you to do anything other than to recall that we did have a conversation about what to do. For example, what resources will you need? What are some short-term and long-term actions you can take? Because remember, we're letting 4 million people free at the end of the Civil War. What happens to those human beings without any resources? As we look at this required source, what we want to do is answer the question here in the green box. And for the most part, what we're looking at is some form of land receipt here. As it tells you here, land order for Richard Brown. Richard Brown, his name is listed here. Notice how they mention in accordance with Major General Sherman's order number 15, and that Richard Brown is about to take possession and occupy 40 acres of land. So we'll see how this is going to play out. But as indicated before, when you let 4 million people free without any resources, education, these questions down here are going to need to be addressed. What is significant about Field Order 15 is it was an attempt in the 1860s to try to acquire land for the freed slave. It mentions here 400,000 acres of land, which is about to be redistributed. Not the first time this was suggested or only time. Thaddeus Stevens in Congress would also advocate for 40 acres and a mule. And I guess Sherman and Stevens recognized that without any education, without any resources, without any land, that the freed slave would be in a dilemma of economic dependency, which is going to lead to the question: does Congress need to set aside land? Who has to give up land? Who's paying for all of this stuff? And eventually the end result is going to be that Andrew Johnson, as it indicates down here, is going to revoke that field order. The attempts by Thaddeus Stevens and the land redistribution is not going to end in the way that the advocates for these policies believed, and the end result is going to be a sharecropping system which places the freed slave in a position of some form of servitude, not slavery, but as mentioned before, possibly indirect slavery, as some of these individuals would still be under indirect control of their former masters. We're just coming back to this document that we already looked at, which argued for 40 acres of land, and Richard Brown was the recipient. But keep in mind, this land is going to be lost when Johnson makes the decision to end these particular programs. Here we have another required document, circular number 8, and it's looking at the freedmen and what life is like after servitude for the year 1866. And just a couple of things that you want to think about here. What issues are emerging from the ending of slavery? As it mentions here, without means of sustenance, who must live by theft or be supported by the government. What they're arguing here is that if there's no resources provided for the freed slave, they might become dependent. But then they also address some other issues up here. So what I want you to do is just analyze that document and try to figure out the significance of this particular source. We have another required source here. And what I want you to do is figure out what you notice in this photograph. The description is here. So we're looking at convicts in a camp for the year 1910. You might want to focus on the people in charge, the racial makeup of all of the people, and anything else that you see. When you look at the rear of this particular postcard, this is what the person wrote. Somewhere in that photograph, we had 4 white convicts. The people in charge, as he mentions here, 5 guards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I found one of the white convicts. This is the question that you want to answer on today's sheet. Now we're going to transition back to those Reconstruction amendments, and this is going to set us up for segregation, the Plessy-Ferguson case, and the eventual end of Reconstruction. We want to remember that we've been looking at loopholes or a way around the law. So even if you have a 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment, the goal by the states' rights theorists are always going to be to try to find a loophole. And that then leads to this chart here, where we kind of go back and forth. Example, the federal government passes the 15th Amendment, says right to vote, and then they come up with these poll tax, literacy tests, and other methods that are state laws designed to act as loopholes around the intended legislation. You want to complete this particular chart here as you look at these 3 segregation laws. Notice the state, Alabama, Georgia, and Georgia. Now, these are the types of questions that you want to answer, because this is going to be the starting point for the next couple of classes. We're going to start our transition to analyzing state laws. And in this case, we're looking at a restaurant. And what's interesting about this law is that they're flat out telling you, you shall not sell to the 2 races within the same room. If you have one restaurant and you plan on selling to both races, it's not going to work. You would be not in compliance with this law. You would need to come up with another solution. You cannot have them in the same room, so maybe what you do is you build the wall. Here we have another task. You need to find a loophole around this marriage law, which is restricting races from getting married. And you want to try to figure out a way around this particular state law for Florida. This is the loophole from the prior law. So we have one law that says you are not allowed to get married. I would then imagine that people found a loophole in the law by just cohabitating, meaning they're living together, which then prompted the state of Florida to pass another law, cohabitation, which is basically going to figure out a way to prevent incidents like this from occurring. We're going to look at a couple of other examples of local, state versus federal. Not all of these are related to segregation. In the task, you want to identify the issue. Issue number one is connected back to slavery. We have the federal language here. We have a advertisement for selling of slaves, and then of course we have a reward for this particular individual who has gone missing. What are the local, state versus federal issues? How about on the issue of abortion? The federal government support for abortion through Roe v. Wade in 1974, but if we're looking at state laws, in this case 1800 Oregon, the question here is whether or not abortion can take place. And there definitely is a loophole. Abortion is illegal, but it can be legal depending on a situation, and that situation is outlined down here. This is a more recent state legislation. This was the Texas Heartbeat Law. And we see once again if the life is in danger, but then they bring up the issue of looking at a fetal heartbeat, and that seems to be the way this state is defining life. In the 2004 election, there was a lot of talk during the debates about passing a constitutional amendment to define marriage. How about transgender bathrooms? What is at the federal level with regard to this issue? And then what is prompting states in 2024 to pass transgender bathroom ban bills like the one outlined here? Eventually, I could see this going to the federal government, to the Supreme Court, to challenge whether or not this particular state law is constitutional or not. Military districts. We're back to the end of the Civil War. And remember that the federal government split up the South into districts, and that this was viewed a certain way by those states of the former Confederacy. How about this scenario? Going back to Sherman's Field Order 15, if this represents the federal government, then the federal government is going to set aside some land. We all know how Johnson reversed that, and the end result led to these particular incidents from occurring. Your final task is to submit a poem from the point of view of the freedmen at the end of the Civil War, as all of these issues are going on, and you're trying to figure out a way to provide for you and your family. At the end of this assignment for today, make sure you have an understanding of those primary source documents as well as these terms here. And if you need to verify your terms, feel free to use this slide.